Hello everyone and welcome to Champions Showdown and to the match everyone's been waiting for. After 16 years of their previous encounter in Reykjavik, Garry Kasparov faces Magnus Carlsen in chess 960, and Magnus Carlsen gets yet another chance to take another crack at the former world champion Garry Kasparov. And it's a really interesting game, but one of the things that I didn't enjoy about this game is that the randomization of the pieces didn't become all that random. As you can see, the rooks are on the exact same place as they are in the regular chess, as also the knights. And once the game develops, it kind of too quickly reaches a position from normal chess. But you'll see what I mean by this. So without further ado, let's check it out. As this is quite a nail biter. So Kasparov with the white pieces opens with d4. We of course have no opening. And I also have an image of this because, like I said in the previous video, you only get 3 minutes before you see the position that you're going to play to analyze it, and then you have to start playing. So here's a nice image of both Garry and Magnus analyzing their positions. Kasparov deep in focus and Magnus having a nice sip of his water. So let's just enjoy that for a brief moment, and then we continue. So d4 by Kasparov. We have d5 by Magnus, and now e3. We have knight f6, knight to f3, e6, and c4. And of course the queen's gambit declined is on the board. I'm just joking, this is chess 960, but it does appear to be very, very similar to standard ideas in normal chess. So here a6 by Magnus, we have knight to c3, and now d captures and c4. We have bishop captures and c5, so playing like it was pretty much normal chess. And here a lot of people were saying Kasparov will just move the queen. Of course, Kasparov is not interested in a queen trade, as Carlsen is thought of more of something like a positional type player, let's say a Karpov 2.0, if you will. And Kasparov, he thrives in really crazy positions where a lot of things happen. So of course everyone was considering moves like this, but Kasparov played d captures on c5, and he offered a queen trade straight from the start. Magnus pre-moved bishop captures on c5, pretty sure he did, and Kasparov traded queens. We have captures and captures. So Carlsen loses castling privileges, but doesn't really matter. Queens are off the board, and the king will be very safe in the center of the board. So here bishop back to d3, fighting for the e4 square. And also, once you castle, maybe you want to use the c-file for your rook. So king to e7 by Magnus, and now a nice queenside castle by Garry. For those of you who are new to chess 960, I said in the previous video, when you castle in chess 960, the position of the king and the rook will be exactly the same as if you castled in normal chess. So here we castle queenside, and the king and rook assume the same position like they would in regular chess. So now that the king is on e7, white castle queenside, it's pretty much a regular chess position already as of move 10. So knight to c6 by Magnus, continuing development, and now comes knight to g5. Kasparov is shifting the attention to this e4 square. He wants to trade some pieces there and maybe even get a bishop to this diagonal, if possible. We have rook to d8. Magnus continues developing his pieces, and now knight g to e4. We have knight captures, and now bishop back to b6 as it's under attack. You could also go bishop to b4, could be very interesting. If white trades, you get a knight to this very nice square, but Magnus prefers the knight, the bishop on b6, and now bishop on c3, putting pressure, not there obviously, putting pressure on the g7 pawn, and Magnus plays f6. So is this one of the positions where it's not okay to play f6? Unlikely. The queens are off the board. The king is very safe there. At some point you will be able to play e5 or f5. So it's a very flexible position. And here Kasparov goes for g4. It's a very dynamic move in somewhat of a steady environment. He wants to play something like rook to g1, play g5, maybe f4, and get something going on the king side, so he doesn't just move pieces around. With bishop to a5 by Magnus, now offering a trade of dark square bishops because, well, Carlsen's dark square bishop, although a very nice piece, not really doing all that much, whereas Kasparov's dark square bishop could be his best piece currently in the position. So, of course, Magnus just trades it up. So, knight, bishop to a5, and Garry trades with bishop captures, knight captures, and now the position is around equalish. Carlsen is somewhat better, as Kasparov still needs to decide what to do with all of those kingside pawns, and well, he's lower on time. There's some 5-minute difference. Kasparov is on 7 minutes on the clock, whereas Magnus is on some 12 minutes on the clock. So bishop back to c2. He offers a trade of rooks, and bishop to c6 now. The bishop will be very strong on this diagonal, and also just putting more defense to this pawn. Here, if knight ever came to c5, this would be a weakness. So now you take care of both of these threats. So rook h to g1. Kasparov now definitely prepares to push the pawn to g5, and now knight to c4. So here Carlsen has some ideas of maybe shifting the knight over to e5 and then to f3, and Kasparov trades once. We have rook captures on d8, rook captures on d8, and now Kasparov pushes g5. So Magnus pretty much instantly replied with f5. He wants to kick away the knight, knight to c3, and here Carlsen took a few minutes to decide on his next move, whether he wants to continue expanding on the queen side, whether he wants to go knight e5 to f3, or possibly bishop to f3, not even allow Kasparov to move this pawn from f2, and it's going to be a very nice blockade here. If rook g5, you can then go knight to e5, and it's a really tough position to play. Really, white would definitely struggle to even find a move here. However, Magnus decides to go for knight to e5 right away, now preparing knight to f3, but now he allows Kasparov to throw in this f4 idea. So f4, knight to f3 attacking the rook, and now rook to g2. Kasparov allows some nasty discoveries, although there aren't all that many of them. Like you could go knight to e1 with a nice attack on the rook and the bishop, but you don't really care. You enjoy your knight more than Kasparov enjoys his bishop here, and once you move the rook, there's not all that much the knight has there. So instead, Magnus went to g6. He just improves the position, and now rook f2. Kasparov moves the rook from any nasty future discoveries. We have e5 for Magnus, now preparing e4, and Kasparov doesn't want to play a waiting move like a3 and allow this e4 idea, so he plays a very, very tricky idea, which, well, maybe loses a pawn. He plays e4. And now it looks very reasonable, as your pawn is protected twice, so it shouldn't be a problem. However, Magnus finds a very nice sequence. F captures on e4, knight captures on e4, and now knight to d4, not allowing Kasparov to push or capture, because here Magnus is threatening to remove the defender of the knight and then just win a piece. So Kasparov needs to move the knight, knight to g3, and now knight captures on c2. We have king captures, and now as, you want to prevent Kasparov from pushing or capturing rook to f8. And now you cannot capture because it's pinned, and of course you cannot push. If you push, for example, pawn to f5, you're just going to get g captures on f5, and there's nothing for you to do, because after knight captures, or rook captures for that matter, doesn't really matter, captures, and bishop to e4 check. This is what Magnus had in mind, and why the idea is so strong. The king would have to move, you're going to capture, and of course win the game. So after this rook to f8, you have to decide what to do. You cannot advance the pawn, you cannot capture because the rook falls. So what you could do is go for knight to e2, a very ugly looking move, very passively defending this f4 pawn. Or you could try rook to e2. Kasparov took some time and really thought things through here, and he didn't like rook e2, because after you give up the pawn and you win back the pawn, you're still not gonna be able to keep it, because king d6, you have to move back with the rook, and then rook g4, the g5 pawn will fall, and then Carlsen's kingside pawns start marching down the board. So here, after rook to f8, Kasparov played the ugly looking knight to e2. And now well, now it's Carlsen to move. King to e6. He's in no rush to do anything here. He just improves the position of his king. Kasparov still has to deal with this pin. So king to d2, and now bishop to b5. And now Carlsen is just preparing to remove the defender of the f4 pawn and win the pawn and hopefully the game. So Kasparov played rook to f3, and when Kasparov played rook to f3, Carlsen went into a really deep thing. He thought for some 5 minutes here, because, well, it looks like you can just win a pawn by capturing the knight and then picking up the pawn, but and while in fact you can, this is probably what Carlsen saw. Bishop captures on e2, king captures, pawn captures, and now as Kasparov made this rook lift to rook to f3, rook to b3, going after the pawn, and now Carlsen thought, okay, rook f7 defends the pawn, and then I can move my king to f5 to g4, and I mean, it's probably, or here and capture this pawn and then just win the game. However, after thinking for 5 minutes, Magnus played rook to f7, and it does make sense. He took all of this into consideration. He said, okay, now this pawn will already be defended. I'm in no rush to capture. I'm gonna capture here next and then gonna win the pawn. But he missed one move from Kasparov, rook to e3. And now there's a problem. You can no longer capture with the pawn, and of course you cannot capture with the rook because now just the rook captures. So Magnus played bishop captures on e2, hoping to grab the pawn on the next move, but now Kasparov has the very simple rook captures on e5 with check. King d6, and now rook captures on e2. And now it's Kasparov who's up a pawn. Of course, Magnus wins it back right away. Rook captures on f4, and now it's a rook endgame with 4 pawns each. And Kasparov already plays the very interesting king to e3. Rook to e3 is a safer way to go if you want to defend everything. For example, if rook g4, then you can go a rook to h3. And now it's a draw. Captures, and now with only 1 pawn each on the king side, it's a very easy draw. Also, after rook to e3, instead of rook g4, if Magnus goes for rook to f2, which is better, then you'd go rook e2, rook f5, Magnus goes after the pawn, you defend it, and after this rook f4, rook to h2, very passive rook for Kasparov, but you defend for the moment. This would be best for Magnus. However, after this king to e3 idea by Kasparov, Magnus plays rook to g4 right away, goes after the pawn, and now rook to d2 check. King e6, and now rook to c2. You could try to go for some tricks with rook to e2 with the idea that if captures, check with an attack on the rook, but Magnus defends with king f6, so it's not a problem. So after this king e6, we have king to c2. Now Kasparov wants to go after the 7th rank. He wants to promote his rook to a pig. And Magnus says, okay, rook captures on g5. We have rook to c7, and now rook to b5. From Magnus, and here the situation on the clock is 1 minute Kasparov, 3 minutes for Carlsen. Here rook to b5 to defend the pawn and go after this one. Also possible was rook to g2 to just go after these 2 pawns. Magnus likes rook to b5. And now Kasparov goes for rook captures on h7. He allows this trade, rook captures on b2, and now a4. So here Magnus is now up a pawn, and it's going to be hard for Kasparov to hold this. We have a5 by Kasparov, and now Kasparov needs to go in with the king. King f4 needs to be played, and then after, let's say, rook b4 check, king b5, we'd see a trade here, captures, and now it's a draw. You're going to eliminate this pawn, and it's not a big deal. Rook a1, king captures here, and 1 passed pawn each on the side of the board. It's a complete draw. However, Kasparov started with h4, and now the position is actually winning for Magnus. So feel free to pause the video and win the game for Magnus while I give you a couple of seconds. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on being a true master of the endgame. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's rook b4. Cutting the king off and just going after this pawn. And now it's very, very hard for Kasparov. We have rook to h6, but now it's not that simple. The position is winning. However, with little time on the clock, you have to be able to play the absolute precise move. And here the only winning move for Carlsen is king to d7, and Magnus missed this move. The idea behind king to d7 is after Kasparov captures on g6 and you capture on h4, the point is after rook g7 check, you will be in time to defend your b7 pawn. You're going to pick up this one, and you will have two connected pawns on the queen side, of course, in a completely winning endgame. However, Magnus played king to f7, seems even better, as I mean you're defending this guy here, and if rook to h7 check, this rook is already guarding the pawn, it's not a problem. However, now it's Kasparov to move and draw the game. There's only one move that helps Kasparov out, so once again, feel free to pause the video and don't lose the game for Garry while I give you a couple of seconds. So, for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on being an excellent avoider of losses. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it's h5, and this settles the game. Here, Carlsen has to capture because now Kasparov is also threatening to create a pass pawn, either with captures or with captures. So Magnus captured, but now rook captures on h5. And now there's a problem. This pawn is hanging. Point being that if Magnus captures this pawn, then rook b5 goes after this pawn, and if you defend, then just rook captures on b4, and this is a well-known draw. You will not be able to win this game being up just one pawn. So here, after rook to h5, b6, Magnus defends this, and now comes rook to e5, cutting off the black king from entering the game. If captures, then the same idea applies. So king f6, we have rook to e4. Of course, Kasparov knows that the rook trade is a draw because his king is much faster. So rook b3 check, and now king to d2. We have king f5, and now rook to h4. Again, cutting the black king off. King e5, and now king to c2. We have rook to f3, and now rook to h6, going after the pawn here. Rook to f6 defending, and now, of course, Kasparov, without much thinking, just trades and goes into a king and pawn endgame. King to d3, king to e5, and now even king to e3, not even rushing with king to c4. So he shows that, of course, this is a complete draw. Plays king e3, king d6 by Magnus, king d4, we have king to c6 and king to c4, and there is no way to make progress for Magnus. He just pushed b5 here, delivered to check, and it was in this position on move 55 that the two of them agreed to a draw, as there is nothing more to be done here for black to push for a win, because after captures with check, king b6, king b3, and captures, white king will just hide in the corner, and of course the black king will not have anything to do about it. So yeah, b5 check, they agreed to a draw, and after 16 years, Carlsen is yet to find his victory, and well, this was a great opportunity. Kasparov doesn't come out of retirement very often. He does like once a year to play some funky tournaments like Chess 960 and stuff, but this is the first time that he faced Carlsen, and it's well, it's a question when Carlsen will get another chance to grab at least one victory against former world champion Garry Kasparov. So yeah, very interesting. Kasparov with a win in round 1 against Firouzja, and then a draw against Magnus in the second round. In the previous video, I told you that it was a double round robin. It's actually not. It's a single round robin. So this is the only game two of them will play in this tournament, and who knows when they will face each other again. But yeah, great start for Kasparov. We'll see what happens, and well, we'll just continue enjoying the show. So once again, I do hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to thank George Ribin, Stanislav Kuperstein, James Patrick, Vashishta Sriram Yapati, and Chess with Shushash for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check two of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Champions Showdown, checking up on your wonderful suggestions, and whatever else happens in the chess world. See you soon.